everyone, and welcome to today's program, Underlying Biases in Consumer Litigation, Identifying and Challenging Hidden Assumptions. I'm Ala Policastro, Director of Education and Professional Development at Beverly Hills Bar Association, and I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Molly McKibben. Molly is a partner at Greene Broillet Wheeler in Los Angeles, where her practice focuses on catastrophic personal injury and wrongful death cases. Her many accolades include being chosen as Consumer Attorneys of California's Consumer Attorney of the Year. She's on the board of CAOC and Consumer Attorneys Association of Los Angeles and is a member of the American Association for Justice, the Association of Business Trial Lawyers, and the Women Lawyers Association of Los Angeles, and the Academy of Truck Accident Attorneys. She's been published in many publications, including the Daily Journal, The Advocate, and Forum Magazine, and volunteers for the Sojourn Domestic Violence Legal Clinic. We can't wait to hear what she has to share with us today, so I'm going to turn it over to her now.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure everyone can see that. All
We're
right.
currently in the back end for the display.
Again, all right. Is that better?
Can you try again? Okay. Let's see.
Maybe if I end and start it again. I am here to talk to you about bias. Some of you are probably here because your MCLE reporting period is soon, but I hope that my presentation gives you something to think about, even if you don't necessarily do consumer litigation, and examining the biases that we may have in litigating cases representing clients, assumptions we make about our clients' claims, our clients' defenses, or the evidence in the case. And so the goal here is just to get you thinking about bias in a different way. So bias is something that we as attorneys and trial attorneys should be intimately familiar with. It's something, if you are in front of juries, that you discuss with them, right? Your goal is to do a liberal and probing examination of all the jurors that are in your panel to decide if they are the right jurors for your case, if they have any biases or prejudices which might affect their ability to be impartial. And this is such an important concept that some states have laws that actually preclude a judge from inhibiting a lawyer in order to do that liberal and probing examination. And so every lawyer has their own example that they will use during voir dire to explain what the concept of bias is so that jurors can understand it and they can recognize, hey, I've been in a car accident myself and I might not be the most impartial juror on a car accident case. And so there are biases that the people and groups who create information that we rely on form assumptions that we or the other side can make about parts of our cases. And we think about it as it relates to the jurors, but oftentimes we don't think about our own biases that we have throughout the course of our client's case. And we can't always trust our brain, right? Biases are simply things that are based on stereotypes. And stereotype is when our brain is making an assumption, making a judgment based on an assumption rather than on actual knowledge. So we perform unconscious classifications of people or things based on our life experiences. We can classify people by age, gender, race, or other stereotypes. And these cognitive shortcuts actually result in prejudgments that can cause us to make rash decisions. Biases can be based on inaccurate information. Sometimes bias can be a good thing, but oftentimes it can be negative. It can perpetuate systemic inequality. It can prevent our clients from receiving fair and equal treatment, whether they are a plaintiff or a defendant in a case. They can result in a client receiving less compensation than they are owed under their circumstances based on the harms that they have suffered. And it can cause us to overlook potential avenues of recovery for our clients. And so when left unchecked, these biases can take over, right? They can cause us to become blind to things that we should be aware of. So this is a tweet that I thought was especially topical. Half of the United States and UK population are women. And the study that was performed was found that women are less likely to have CPR performed on them because men are afraid of being accused of being inappropriate. Women are also experience bias in a variety of other ways. For instance, the Apple Health Kit that was available on the iPhone, still available on the iPhone, had specialized tracking that was made available, including what your copper intake was. But it wasn't until iOS 9, so 9 versions of the operating system of this phone, that a period tracker was available, because there was an assumption that that was not something that, you know, a 50% of the population would be interested in. Whoops, I'm sorry about that. And so it's important for us to examine these biases and the information that we're relying on, or the life experience that we have, right? Many of the men that were in the study likely had some life experience that made them feel like they would not feel comfortable or thought it would be inappropriate to perform CPR on a woman that they didn't know. You know, a study that was performed recently on Google's search engine found that it creates an echo chamber for negative stereotypes. So, for instance, when you type in the phrase "are women" into Google, the first things that pop up are women evil? Are women allowed in combat? Or lastly, are women attracted to money? Not are women smart? Are women capable? Are women, you know, in Congress? These are the things that Google is automatically populating for a person who is doing a search on the internet. And speech to text tools, there was a study that was done in 2020 and found that speech to text tools that many of us use in our day-to-day life were mistranscribing African American voices at a rate almost double of those of white people. And so these are just, again, ways in which the world is created based on stereotypes, based on biases, and we have to think about how is that going to apply to our practice and our representation of clients. This tweet just made me laugh, but it is absolutely true. So one important thing I think to understand, if you are in litigation that involves medicine in any way, whether it's a medical malpractice case, whether it's a pharmaceutical case, whether it's a personal injury case or wrongful death case, you have to examine the information on which your experts, the treating physicians, are relying, and where is that coming from? So the public health system in the United States has been historically biased towards the male perspective. In 1977, the FDA actually recommended that women of childbearing years be excluded from all clinical research. And because of this gendered bias, many women now experience delayed diagnoses, misdiagnoses, and suffer from adverse drug effects. Because if we're not included in clinical trials for a medicine, it's very likely that that medicine and the makers of that medicine have no idea how it will affect women, you know, ages 16 to 45. And so it's unsurprising that 8 of the 10 of the drugs that were removed from US markets in the 90s were removed almost exclusively because of adverse effects that were suffered by women. And it wasn't until 1989 that the National Institute of Health amended its policy to include women and minorities in research studies. But it wasn't until 1993 that this policy became federal law. And it wasn't until 2016 until the National Institute of Health actually required that sex be considered a variable in these clinical trials. So it is unsurprising then that in 2015, there were 5 times more studies on erectile dysfunction than there were on PMS, even though only 19% of men experience erectile dysfunction and 95% of women experience PMS. Cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death for women, but only 5% of National Institute of Health funding goes towards research around coronary artery disease for women. And out of 112 internal medicine residency programs reviewed in 2016, 25% of them, a quarter of them, did not include any instruction on menopause, and 70% did not include any instruction on fertility. So again, these are just more examples of the information that exists in the world, the structure that has been created, the assumptions that people who do studies, that people that put information out make, and that leads to biases that can leak into our cases and assumptions that we make about our cases. So one of the first areas I want to talk about how these biases can affect our cases in representing consumers is workplace safety. So women are becoming more and more involved in construction. Prior to 2016, women accounted for roughly 9 out of every 100 employees in the construction workforce. However, since then, the female employment share has climbed nearly every year and is at over 11%. And they're more involved in trades. The number of apprenticeships held by women has more than doubled from 2014 to 2022. And the number of women in apprenticeships has reached its highest level ever, over 300,000 women. And despite that fact, the equipment that many of these women are being given is not designed for their bodies. When a person participates in an apprenticeship program, whether that's for construction or electrical work, or anything at all involving an apprenticeship, the program typically provides them equipment that they're going to need in order to do their job. But that has not been broadened to include equipment that is specifically designed for the female body. Now, we know it's very obvious that safety clothing and equipment helps avoid accidents, things like harnesses, hard hats, fall protection systems, goggles, gloves, but it's designed for the average male body. So goggles do not fit their faces. Flame-resistant clothing is too big or too long. Safety vests and harnesses are given in a men's size small, which still may be too big for a lot of women. And it makes sense then that improperly fitting safety equipment can either contribute to or cause injuries. So female firefighters experience a 4 times greater rate of injury than men, in part because of their ill-fitting personal protective equipment. And that's an added obstacle that a female faces in order to become a successful female firefighter, right? Is that she has to pass all the same tests and do all the same things that her male counterparts do. But then she also has to maybe walk and learn to walk in boots that are a size too big, or deal with clothing that does not properly fit her body and impedes her ability to run or carry a ladder. So, some examples that I saw when I was researching this talk were women being given welding boots in a size men's 9.5. And I know that a lot of women do not have a shoe that big. Being given gloves that were so huge that they couldn't pick up tools. And so what is happening in from a practical standpoint is women are taking their own money and having to go buy equipment, but many of them do not have the money to do that. So the lack of appropriate PPE can also present employment issues from an employment perspective. So looking for the correct PPE can delay a person's hiring, or complaining about the fact that I don't have the properly fitting equipment can lead to retaliation or firing. And in fact, there were 2 lawsuits, one in 2017, where a police officer sued her department after they refused to give her protective gear that would fit her body as she was pregnant. They refused to give her a properly sized bulletproof vest, so she didn't have one, and they denied her request to carry some of her equipment in her pockets in her vest to lessen the strain on her abdomen, as she's required to carry a 25-pound duty belt. And there was a 2015 lawsuit in Louisiana where a shipyard employer failed to provide appropriate PPE for a female equipment or for a female employee, and she sued alleging gender discrimination. This obviously extends to the military. I know not a lot of our cases involve the military, but I have had many clients who have military experience or are current military members, and lifting and carrying heavy loads for long periods of time are a major risk factor for musculoskeletal injuries. And researchers say that carrying more than 10% of your body weight increases the chance of injury exponentially. And so based on the Army's height and weight standards for soldiers, a woman between the ages of 21 and 27 who stands 5 feet 7 tall can carry up to 100, or it typically weighs about 161 pounds, which means she should be carrying about 16 pounds of equipment. But when these soldiers go on road marches, they have a 35-pound rucksack. And in the field, their rucksack can weigh up to 50 pounds. So instead of being given equipment that fits their bodies, these women are forced to adapt to ill-fitting gear. And they are required to wear the gear that the Army issues during their basic training. And once they are assigned to a unit, they can purchase other equipment. But that is, again, another hurdle that these women face. This also bleeds into medical professionals. So the American Medical Association estimates that over a quarter of doctors in the United States are women now. And this is up dramatically from the 1970s, where it was only about 5 to 7%. 50% of all medical school applicants are women, and the total proportion of practicing female doctors is only going to grow dramatically in the coming years. But again, most instruments are designed for male hands. Women's hands, or male doctors, women's hands are smaller than men's. A man's thumb size can be as much as half to 1.5 times bigger than a woman's. Women have about half the grip strength traditionally, and squeezing strength as men. And the consequences of that are that their smaller fingers will float in finger holes for forceps or scissors or things like that, potentially causing discomfort, but more importantly, potentially causing instability and affecting their ability to perform surgeries or procedures. And then instruments that require them to do extra squeezing is going to cause repetitive damage to their ligaments and joints, and may cause them to exit the workforce earlier because they may have a disability. This is a study that came out fairly recently where the things that I'm talking about in terms of ill-fitting equipment was confirmed. And the study actually drew on 67 hours of operating observation, where the researchers actually observed female surgeons and compared them with male surgeons. And these surgeons reported having all the same issues that I'm talking about. Everything from their surgical spaces to their tools were designed with the male body in mind, and made their job much more difficult than their male counterparts. Another way that bias can rear its head in workplace safety is the actual way that the environment that someone is working is designed. So a great example are airline cockpits. They are designed to fit the measurements and proportions of a male body. So in order to operate the equipment, you have to have a certain amount of strength and be a certain height. And a study that was done found that 70% of female pilots could not appropriately reach the pedals, could not appropriately reach the flight deck controls, levers, and points of visibility within the cockpit. Another area that you see this issue is in truck and tractor cabs. For commercial drivers, women can have a difficult time reaching controls and getting the seats adjusted while still maintaining contact with their pedals. This is also not only disadvantages women, but it also disadvantages people of color who may be smaller in size than the average white male. Another way that we see bias affect workplace safety it relates specifically to race. So worker fatalities have increased year over year since about 2015. White worker deaths only increased in the time frame from 2015 to 2019, the white worker deaths only increased about 1.7%. But Hispanic worker deaths increased 20%. Black worker deaths also increased by 28%, and Asian American worker deaths increased by 59% during that same period. And the question is often why? Why is there that exponential increase for people who are not white? And one of the basic answers that research has shown is that workers of color are traditionally assigned the most dangerous jobs. And there are often language barriers for these workers to understand how to properly operate machinery, to understand instructions and warnings, and not having them in their native languages puts them at a disadvantage. They also have difficulty reporting workplace safety issues if they have immigration status concerns. So they might, push through and work through dangerous working conditions. So if someone who is in charge of safety knows a group of people are more likely to be injured or die, right? If you have workers that are not white, they have an obligation that they do everything they can to make them safe, whether that's provide them instructions in their native language or make sure that they are being given opportunities to work in roles that are not the most dangerous or the most likely to cause them an injury. Another area where we see bias, where we see these prejudgments and stereotypes, is in insurance claims. If you have a client that has a bad faith claim, or whether it's first party or whatnot, this is an area where bias is very, very prevalent. So this State Farm lawsuit, it was from 2022, and it was born out of a study that was done by a civil rights organization and a firm that a law firm that predominantly handled civil rights issues. And the study found that Black homeowners were having issues getting insurers to pay their claims. So the study focused on a 9-month period from 2021 with about 800 participants. And State Farm is the largest homeowner insurer in the United States. And the study found that white customers were able to get their claims approved and with fewer than 3 interactions with the insurance company employees. And they were 1/3 more likely to have their claims paid in less than 1 month. Versus Black customers were 20% more likely to have to talk to a representative on at least 3 occasions and much more likely to have to do extra paperwork. So pretty stark, the experience for white insureds versus Black insureds. And another way that insurance companies, and I think this is becoming more and more prevalent every day, is their use of AI. So State Farm uses specialized technology, as I'm sure many companies do, and they use it to help process their claims. And they use a software from an AI firm called Friss that flags claims for potential fraud. And the way that Friss decides that a claim is potentially fraudulent is that it gives each policyholder a risk score by running the customer's information through its algorithm and its computer programs, which analyzes the language and their claim narrative, as well as the customer's profile. And they provide the score based on demographic data about the neighborhood, such as the degree of urbanization, their words, not mine, crime statistics, and data harvested from social media. So both of these things I think are important to keep in mind where you have a bad faith claim and you're dealing with arguments of mitigation of damages, or where your client's claims about having difficulty getting claims paid are not being believed. I think it's important to really delve into what was their personal experience, how did their claim process go forward, and then also think about what is the data that State Farm is relying upon, or the insurance company is relying upon, to make their judgment call about whether to approve a claim or deny a claim. One way that we here in California have addressed bias and the reality of the world that our clients live in and that their cases are presented is in the area of lost earnings. And there has been legislation that has actually changed the course of how the calculation of lost earnings was being done. So California barred the use of race, gender, or ethnicity considerations in experts calculating lost earnings. So was the first law of its kind in the United States that was passed. It's California Civil Code Section 3361, and you can see it here on the screen, where it says that you cannot, an expert is not to consider race, gender, or ethnicity in their calculations. And the reason why this legislation was passed is that court experts typically rely on the Bureau of Labor Statistics current population survey in order to do their analysis, right? I know I've worked with many economists who have done that, and I've had many economists on the other side who have done that. In fact, 1/2 of economists said that they would consider race, and 92% said they would consider gender in their calculations when projecting out someone's potential for earnings. But the problem with this is that these tables are a reflection of gender pay gaps and of workforce discrimination. So it's automatically undervaluing the damages of women and minorities by hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the consequence of using biased data is that you're using averages that represent generations of discriminatory practices. So this is just perpetuating systemic inequality. It's bigger than just individual plaintiffs as well. So when we talk about individual plaintiffs, I have this example on the screen. So you're comparing a male and female plaintiff who are the same age and have a substantially different projected earnings. So the female, a Hispanic female, has damages reduced by $27,000 a year over a 40-year lifetime. It's a difference of $1 million. So that's pretty significant. Another example is claims involving a Black female versus a white male, a difference of over $1 million. So these are substantial differences that are based on purely biased information that is unfairly being applied to these clients. So it's bigger than just these individual plaintiffs, though, right? So imagine if a waste management company is looking for a site to build somewhere to dispose of hazardous materials. And the company and local officials have to evaluate the risk that an accident may cause to the surrounding community and consider their potential liability if that happens, right? So if race-based tables are used to estimate liability, there is a financial incentive to these companies and to these local governments to locate the facility among residents who would be more likely to be awarded less money. So inspired by California, Oregon actually recently passed a similar law, and I'm hopeful that this will spread like wildfire, and this prohibition against considering biased data will apply all across the United States. Another way that we see the biased data applied to our clients' cases is in pain, right? So you have a client that comes to you and they say, I've had this injury, I'm experiencing this kind of pain. And it can seem very straightforward, but when you have an expert on the other side who may be discrediting what your client is saying, it's important to examine the information that they're relying upon to say that your client's maybe not telling the truth, your client is maybe exaggerating. And so it's really, I think, vital for us as attorneys to critically analyze the information that we are relying upon when we're hearing our clients' stories at intake, when we're prepping them for deposition, and also when we're evaluating the opposing experts' opinions and testimony at deposition and trial. So, women's pain historically and consistently has been underestimated, and men's pain has been consistently overestimated. And I want to be clear that I'm not coming on here as, someone who is saying that men are terrible and women are the best or, wholly aggrieved, but this is what the data shows. This is something that has been consistently found by researchers, and it is not just my opinion. So one of the studies that was done compared a patient's pain rating with an observer's rating. So the patient would come in and say, I'm having a 7 out of 10 pain, and they would have an observer who would observe the patient throughout the visit to see, what did the patient appear to be in pain? Did the patient grimace when they were doing certain tests or when their body did certain things that were consistent with what they were reporting? And throughout the study, they found that women's pain was consistently underestimated by the observer, and a man's pain was consistently overestimated. So that's not surprising, given that women's pain is often disregarded and minimized by healthcare providers. Healthcare providers often, based on how they are trained or the information they're given in medical school, view women's pain as an emotional exaggeration or are very quick to blame physical pain on stress. And this has led to a pain gap in which women with true medical emergencies are often pushed aside. Now, it's even worse if you are a Black woman, right? Studies show that Black women, or doctors do not believe that Black women are in as much pain as they complain about because of implicit biases that have existed for decades and generations about how Black people process pain. And this is a dynamic that stems from slavery, during which it was a common belief that Black people had a higher pain tolerance than their white counterparts, which is just not based in any medicine whatsoever. One area that you see very starkly the difference between consideration of male and female pain is as it relates to heart attacks. So there was a 2000 study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine that found that women were 7 times more likely than men to be misdiagnosed and discharged in the middle of having a heart attack. And why is that? Well, because most medical concepts of diseases are based on the male physiology, right? Our understanding of the male physiology. And women and men actually have very different symptoms when it comes to a heart attack. Men, typically you see they're clutching their chest and they've got their arm. Whereas women, the number one symptom of a heart attack is actually nausea. And it's very easy for a doctor to attribute, especially in the case of a woman, nausea to something else, to her period, to pregnancy. I think if you're a woman on here, this call, you've probably been to a doctor's visit for something totally unrelated to your reproductive organs, but still been asked to take a pregnancy test. So I think the problem is that many of our physicians are being trained based solely on the male physiology. And so if nausea, for instance, is not a prime symptom that appears in men to recognize a heart attack, that's not something that physicians are going to be trained to look for in women. Additionally, chronic pain is somewhere where we see a really disparate treatment of men and women. If you have a client, I know we have many that come to us complaining of chronic pain, and it's going to be a very different experience from a man to a woman. 70% of people who experience chronic pain are women, right? So they disproportionately have chronic pain problems compared to men. And yet 80% of studies about chronic pain are performed on male mice or human males. So only 20% of these studies are done for women, about women, and 70% of the sufferers of this condition are women. So one of the few studies to research the gender difference in pain actually found that women tend to feel it more of the time and more intensely than men. So again, something to consider when you have a client that is approaching you with complaints of pain, or if you are on the other side and the plaintiff is a woman, there are different considerations that you should make when evaluating how their pain scores may be being reported by a treater, or what they may be saying to an expert. Another area that I think it's really important to recognize the bias that underlies our clients' experience is their experience going to the emergency room. We want to believe that when someone goes to emergency room, it doesn't matter what their race, what their gender, what their age is, they will be treated all the same because of the Hippocratic Oath. They will get the great care and treatment that they need. But the reality is that this is not the case at all. So here are just a handful of the ways in which people are treated differently. And again, there are many studies and much data to support these statements, but ways in which people are treated different in their emergency room experiences. So CT scans, for instance, Latino patients are offered CT scans at a much lower rate than their white counterparts. For pain medication, Black and Latino patients are less likely to receive pain medication at all. So if you have a client who comes to you and says that they went to the emergency room and they were released without pain medication, it doesn't mean that they didn't need pain medication or their injury didn't warrant being medicated. It just may mean that some systemic bias that exists with how the emergency room is being operated or how the providers were trained caused them to perhaps minimize the pain that this patient was feeling and not prescribe it. Wait times. Black patients experience significantly longer wait times than other groups of people. And so again, if you have a client who went to the emergency room for an injury and left without being treated, I would not make the assumption that that means that they were not seriously injured. It may just be that they were there for hours and they were never seen and got frustrated and left and maybe went to a local urgent care or somewhere where they thought that they could get treatment more quickly. Chest pain. Similarly to the disparate treatment for women with heart attack, it's unsurprising then that women with chest pain wait 25% longer to be seen than men with chest pain. Biological differences in male and females. So they did a study of medical students, and the study found, and I think this was fairly recently, that white medical students held at least one false belief about biological differences between blacks and whites. And that's a problem. If these are the people who are going out in the world and becoming doctors, and they hold an inaccurate view on how a black person and a white person may, for instance, experience pain, that is an issue. And they are going to go out in the world and they're going to be practicing and treating people, and they're also going to be training other doctors. Abdominal pain. Women with abdominal pain were 25% less likely to be prescribed pain medication for that. And that also can come from a bias that women's abdominal pain is period related or, stress related versus consideration that it might be a burst appendix or a problem with their gallbladder, something like that. So I think it's really important to recognize that just because an emergency room did not do a particular course of treatment or did not respond to your client in a certain way does not negate their symptoms or injuries. It could be, in fact, due to these systemic differences. You may discover that your client was never actually seen, that they waited too long. And it doesn't mean that they didn't experience a serious injury. It just means that they experienced unequal care. And that should be addressed in how you approach the case, how you approach discovery, how you approach cross-examination. I think it's really important to consider these real-life experiences that your client has had. A very specific area where we see big differences, and that I think the largely are in gender, is how patients experience and resolve from traumatic brain injuries. So if you are not familiar with the TRACK TBI group and you are someone who does TBI cases or is interested in doing TBI cases, I highly recommend you read the studies that they have put out. But they did a study in 2000 that studied mild traumatic brain injury patients for 2 months after injury. And there's the severity and duration of cognitive and somatic symptoms in women was significantly worse than it was in men compared to an orthopedic trauma control group. And so we need to understand, and researchers don't necessarily know the answer for this yet, but they need to understand whether these differences in how women and men process and respond to traumatic brain injury are unique to mild traumatic brain injury, or that it is generally the case for injuries for men and women. Because one thing that is very unique about brain injuries is that they rely very heavily on subjective reporting from a patient, right? Women are much more likely to seek out medical treatment. They are much more likely to be more narrative in their complaints about what's going on with them. Men are often taught not to go to the doctor or not to seek out treatment about things that they may view as emotional, right? Many of the symptoms of a brain injury are not that you can't move your arms or your legs or you're having pain, although pain certainly can be associated with it, but it's often things like I'm having trouble remembering things, I'm depressed, I feel super anxious, or I'm very quick to anger. And those things are often, and society teaches men not to reach out for help for those. So it's important for researchers to discern, and TBI is an area that has only in the last decade and a half really gotten a ton of funding for research, but it's something that researchers need to discern what the differences are. Are they actual biologic responses that the body is having that causes different symptomology, or is it a difference in how our society functions, how our medical providers function? And so that's just an area that we need more research. But the studies that we have done do show that 60%, the 60% of those studies show that TBI sufferers who are women experience slower resolution of their post-concussive symptoms. They experience more emotional symptoms, and they generally have worse outcomes. So again, something to consider asking a defense expert if they're saying your client is fine and should be fine and they should have resolved within a month. Did they consider the patient's gender in making their analysis? And one of the reasons why we don't know so much about how women suffer from TBIs and how they recover from TBIs is that, as I talked about earlier, women have typically been underrepresented in studies and clinical trials, and they've often been wholly excluded from preclinical studies. And we know that women and men's bodies are not identical. Their bodies, we know, react to trauma differently and they heal differently, not even talking about brain injuries, just talking about injuries as a whole. And so we also know that women are in certain populations that are more likely to experience a TBI. So they're more likely to be at higher risk than men are. Intimate partner violence, domestic violence, affects 6.2 million women per year. And so it's very common for women to experience brain injuries as a result of partner violence. So if women are not represented in these studies, if they are not being considered when we're trying to find out how brain injuries work and what the resolution for them looks like, then the conclusion from these studies may not apply to women. So if a study says that the majority of TBI patients recover within 3 months, but that study doesn't include any women, how can that study be used to form an opinion about the recovery trajectory of your client? Another thing that I think it came out last year, a study came out last year, is that pregnancy brain is real. And why is that relevant to TBI? So I want to connect the dots for you. A study was done where MRI scans were taken every few weeks from before a woman was pregnant until 2 years after she gave birth. And what it revealed is widespread reorganization of her brain during pregnancy. And some of those changes were short-lived and some of those lasted a long time. So the most apparent change was a steady decrease in gray matter in the brain in both volume and thickness throughout pregnancy, and a temporary peak in neural connectivity, which is like the white matter microstructure of the brain, at the end of the second trimester. And both the cerebrospinal fluid and their ventricles, which are the brain cavities, expanded during pregnancy. And these changes were linked to their rising hormone levels, which is unsurprising. And some of these changes persisted past pregnancy, right? They were found in the 2 years post-birth. So that global reduction in gray matter volume was something that persisted. And so this is, again, something that needs to be studied more. Are women who are pregnant, do they rebound? Does their brain rebound to where it was pre-pregnancy? Or are these changes in gray matter and neural connectivity, are those permanent? Because this study ended after 2 years. So again, something to consider if you have a client who has a brain injury that either was pregnant at the time or has ever been pregnant, and how that pregnancy may have affect the actual organization and structure of that person's brain. Another area that we see bias data influencing how people are treated in both our cases and in their day-to-day treatment with medical providers are in spinal cord injuries. So 2 parts of the spine, the cervical spine up here by your neck and your lumbar spine down by your pelvis. So the lumbar spine in women is more curved, and it makes the female body more susceptible to fracture and dislocation. And it is more curved to support the uterus during pregnancy. That's not surprising, but it just makes it more stable but less mobile. So in a crash or something, it's more likely to be injured. And then the cervical spine is more flexible in women, and women have a more increased range of motion. So they are typically more protected in their cervical spine area than men and are less likely to have fractures compared to a man. So again, something to consider if you have a client who is presenting with a cervical or lumbar issue. My personal favorite area where we see bias data influencing our day-to-day as people who navigate the world in a car, as well as our clients' experience if we have a case involving a vehicle, is automobile safety tests. So auto design is directly influenced by the results of safety testing. So any bias in the way that a car is tested translates, obviously, into the way that the car is designed and manufactured. Car companies design their cars specifically to pass crash tests so they can market them to consumers as safe. Hey, this has undergone all these crash tests, it's passed them, and this is a very safe car for you to buy for you and your family. So if the tests do not take into account the differences between male and female occupants, then car makers will not make changes to better protect men and women who, as we've just discussed, are very different physically. So women are the majority of drivers in the United States. Did not used to be that way, but it is true today. And they are still historically less likely to get into a crash than men, but they're at a higher risk of injury and death in a car crash. They're 73% more likely to be injured, and they are 17% more likely to die than men. And why is that? Well, crashes occur in 3 phases. So there's first the vehicle crash, where the impact of the car into a foreign object, like a wall or another car or a tree. Then there's the human crash, where the body of the vehicle's occupants are coming into contact with things inside the cars, like windshields, windows, seat belts, airbags. And lastly, there's the internal crash, which is the collision of organs, bones, soft tissues within the human body. So crash energy that is not absorbed by the vehicle in the first stage is transferred to the occupants during the human crash and the internal crash. So vehicle restraint systems, seatbelts, airbags, are intended to limit motion and limit the transfer of energy, right? That's the whole purpose of them. So to do that effectively, car makers need to consider not just the size differences of occupants, but also the material properties of their bodies, the differences in bone density, the difference in percentage of muscle mass, and things like that. It's a very important factor that car manufacturers should be considering, but because car testing is not requiring them to do so, only really one auto manufacturer is doing that, and I will tell you who in a second. So crash tests today are based exclusively on the male dummy. So crash test dummies were invented in 1976. They did not create one. The government did not create a female one, I should say, because one, they didn't have enough money. And two, men at the time were the ones mostly dying in cars. Women were in the workforce less and they were driving less. So at the time this dummy was created, he was a 171 pound, 5'9" dummy. Men today are actually on average 26 pounds heavier. So a female dummy was not introduced until 2003. So 27 years of car safety policy and research was based on the 50th percentile 1970s male body, was not updated in any way. In 1980, NHTSA actually proposed updating the male dummy and adding a family of dummies, a woman and a child. But in 1981, Ronald Reagan became president and slashed NHTSA's budget, and nothing came of that. So in 2003, NHTSA finally put a female dummy in a car. But the problem with that female dummy, as you can see here on the screen, was that it was just a scaled down version of the male dummy with boobs, basically. And it represents only the smallest 5% of women by 1970 standards, not even by 2003 standards. It's so small that it could be a 12-year-old child. And women are 5.5 inches shorter and 27 pounds lighter on average than the average male. But we were just using basically a 12-year-old child dummy since 2003. And no dummy takes into account the biological differences between male and female bodies, right? As we talked about earlier with the lumbar spine is different. The cervical spine is different. A female's pelvis is geometrically different than a male's because it's designed to hold and give birth to a baby. The internal makeup of female bones is different. Women are more prone to osteoporosis and osteopenia. We have different muscle mass. Women are more likely to suffer whiplash injuries than men. And car manufacturers also don't take into account, because car testing does not take into account, how a woman might be positioned differently in a vehicle than a man. A woman may be closer to the steering wheel. A woman, I know that I'm closer to the steering wheel than my husband. I'm 5'2", he's 6'2". Our settings in our car are very different. We may wear our seatbelts differently. I move mine down. My husband moves his up. And car manufacturers and automotive testing does not take that into account. So the first truly representative female crash dummy was not invented until 2022. And it was not invented by the government, but by a group of researchers led by Dr. Astrid Lind from Sweden. And she created a dummy who represents the 50th percentile of women in height. So this dummy is 5'3", and 20th 5 percentile in weight, 137 pounds. It has a bust, it has wider hips, it has narrower shoulders. The stiffness of the neck is different. And she put all of the data from all the testing she did with this dummy on the internet for free and makes it available to any car manufacturer, automotive organization throughout the world that wants to see it. And in May 2024, there was a bipartisan bill introduced in the United States to include a female dummy in crash testing. And it was called the She Drives Act. And so hopefully that is something that gets passed and that automotive testing is made standard to have a female dummy included that not only reflects our size, but it reflects how our body is actually put together and where we carry our weight and what makes sense. In a perfect world, we'd also have a pregnant dummy, but I'm not going to get greedy. So we know that these changes can be made to address these differences. So it was already done as it relates to airbags. And from 1996 to 2000, 180 people were killed by airbags in low-speed crashes that should not have been fatal. And of that 180, 118 were children. So the government and auto manufacturers realized that it had to do with airbags being programmed to be powerful enough to keep a 50th percentile man in his seat in a crash, even if he was not wearing his seatbelt. So NHTSA, recognizing, hey, a lot of children are dying because these airbags are too strong, relaxed the testing requirements for the auto manufacturers to rapidly redesign airbags using a sled test instead of a more expensive, more time-consuming version of a test. And nearly one half of auto manufacturers reduced the power of their airbags between 1997 and 98, so in 1 year. And by 1998, NHTSA required car manufacturers to install advanced airbags that deploy with a force that is proportional to the weight of the occupant in the seat. And what happened was there was a massive drop in fatalities. So the only auto manufacturer that is doing testing with biologically correct dummies is Volvo. And they have what's called an EVA initiative, which shares 40 years of research and testing that they've been doing. They have a whiplash protection system that they've installed in their vehicles, and it reduces the difference of incidence in whiplash injuries between men and women. So recognizing that there is this difference, they created this system. They also designed something called SIPS, Side Impact Protection System, to cover the entire window. So it's protecting women who are generally smaller and sit lower and closer to the steering wheel. And they actually created the first virtual pregnant crash test dummy, who they called Linda, who represents a woman in her 36th week of pregnancy. And if you're not familiar with automotive testing, a lot of it is now done with computer modeling. And so they actually designed a pregnant dummy. And the last thing I want to talk about is bias in artificial intelligence, a hot topic, I'm sure, for many people now. So automated systems are not inherently neutral. They reflect the priorities, preferences, prejudices, I guess you could call it the coded gaze of whoever created them and chose to model their intelligence. In modern AI, right, data rules. The software is only as smart as the data that is being used to train it. And so these algorithms, if you're familiar with them, they work by comparing one data model to similar ones from the past but it takes a healthy dose of human judgment, at least at this junction, before we've gone full Terminator, to figure out the right context for a particular data model. So engineering teams have a significant hand in defining these models and thereby the resulting technology. So if there's bias in what they're choosing to train these models on, there's going to be bias in their results. So one widely used facial recognition data set was estimated to be more than 75% male and more than 80% white. So you can imagine what the results from that data set are going to be. So some examples that you see where this bias reveals itself in AI is that in 2015, Google's image recognition system labeled Black people as gorillas. In 2018, the ACLU tested Amazon's facial recognition software against members of Congress, or with members of Congress against 25,000 public mugshots. And the system generated 28 false matches, and 11 of those 28 were misidentified people of color, so almost 40%. So if there are many more white men than Black women in a system, it will be worse at identifying Black women. We know this. And all of the companies that were studied for this facial recognition AI recognize male faces at a much higher rate than female faces. So this is just not surprising, right? We have to do better at making sure that the data that AI is being used to be trained on is truly neutral and non-gendered, non-racist data. And as long as we're not doing that, and many of these data sets are not publicly available, so there's no way to check, we are going to be consistently seeing biased results. MIT evaluated some companies actually, and it had error rates of no more than 1% for facial recognition for light-skinned men. But for darker-skinned women, the errors went up to 35%. And AI systems, facial recognition systems from all of these companies, from Google, from Amazon, from everywhere, have failed to correctly classify the faces of many famous non-white people like Oprah Winfrey or Michelle Obama or Serena Williams. So again, you're seeing the results of that data, biased data. This one is, I think, could very well be relevant to an injury case with a loss of earnings or an employment case. But even robots apparently think that women should only make 83% of men's salaries. So this study, I think, came out last year, found that AI often advises women and minorities to ask for lower salaries than men. And that's because AI pulls from existing data, which often mirrors the biases of the people that created and the systemic inequalities that exist within our world. So if the data shows that women have historically earned less, AI will suggest that they ask for lower salaries. So this is a problem when many companies are relying on AI for recruiting. And this kind of shows that these biases are going to continue going unchecked. And the last thing I want to talk about as it relates to AI and algorithms and bias is automotive, I cannot think of the word, self-driving cars. Self-driving cars. So if you do auto products cases or you have any cases that you're considering or defending on behalf of a self-driving car like a Waymo, this is important information to think about. So there was a study out of the Georgia Institute of Technology where it found that people with dark skin are more likely to be hit by a self-driving car than a person with lighter skin. So the detection accuracy of these vehicles is lower by an average of 5 percentage points for people who have darker skin. And this was held true even when they controlled for the time of day or whether the vehicle had an obstructed view. And the researchers in the study found by doing some further analysis that the bias was probably caused by two things. One, the vehicles were, the algorithm that was used for the vehicles was trained using too few examples of dark-skinned individuals, and it was given less emphasis on learning from those examples that did exist. This study is not peer-reviewed. I'm not going to sit here and say that this is some peer-reviewed study. And it didn't test any object detection models actually being used by self-driving cars. And it couldn't use any training data sets that are, as far as we know, actually being used by autonomous vehicle manufacturers. But again, the problem with that is that the companies do not make this data publicly available. So these researchers had to do the best they could with models that have been used and created by academic researchers and publicly available data sets by people who have at least made them available. So I think this is information that's really important for the public to understand. It's an issue of public safety. What data are these vehicles being trained on? And is it data that is not unbiased and is going to cause disproportionate harm to people who have darker skin, who are typically people of color? So that is the bulk of my presentation. I hope that it was helpful, even if you don't have a case that's dealing with this specific issue, to consider, perhaps some ideas and some of the information that you're relying upon to do your cases and evaluate your clients' claims and damages. I have just 1 minute left, I think, or maybe not, but I have 2 questions. Let's see. Are these biases also prevalent and equivalent in jury verdicts and damage awards and other types of injuries like housing and racial discrimination? I would absolutely think so. And I think that goes back to jury selection and why jury selection is so important, to make sure that you are truly getting a jury that is unbiased, because bias does not mean that a person is malicious or that they're out to get your client, whether you're a plaintiff or defendant. It just means that they have some life experience that has caused them to feel or think a certain way about, your client's case or who they are as a person. So I think it's just really important to examine and demand of a judge that you are allowed to be given the opportunity to examine all the jurors. Do I provide expert services? I do not. In the area of bias, I do not. I am just a lowly attorney. But yeah, so that was my presentation. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope it was helpful.
This concludes today's presentation. Thank you so much, Molly, for an excellent presentation. Thank you again to our audience. Have a great day, everybody.